Speaker, I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak to the 13 bills that the regulatory reform bill has been broken into. I want to talk just about a couple of aspects. I don't want to talk about all of the different 13 amendment bills that are contained here. I just want to focus on a couple of them. Before we start, I think it is interesting to hear, and I thought Jonathan Young made an interesting speech about the kind of philosophical framework for regulatory reform that the government's adopted. And I thought it was a useful exposition, actually, of where the government comes from. I think, because in many respects, I think many people would agree with what Jonathan Young said, in the sense that he was saying, well, how do we try to reduce the kind of the negative impacts of regulation on the operation of business? And I think it's certainly true that there are regulations that exist that do have negative implications for business, and I think we'd all agree that there's a case for amending or reforming those to make sure they don't have that effect. And I guess in a way, that's pretty much the government doesn't have a lot of economic agenda beyond that kind of microeconomic reform. So in some ways that approach typifies actually the government's approach, which is microeconomic reform. And the government's approach overall is to do these kind of microeconomic reforms in the hope that by keeping hands off more generally that there will be some kind of great economic miracle. And to some degree, there's no question that there is a role for that kind of economic approach. The problem, I think, is more broadly is that if you look at macroeconomic policy, the government's approach to macroeconomic policy more generally is quite problematic. Aside from picking a few winners like the mining industry, they're not assisting some of our most important export sectors. So while this bill before us, I think, makes some contribution, it has to be seen in the broader picture of the government's economic strategy, which is very much lacking, and of course is reflected in the poor economic performance of New Zealand under this government. Well, of course, accepting there have been external factors which have influenced the economic performance of New Zealand as well, undoubtedly. The fact that the government lacks an economic strategy more generally, I think, has been problematic. In terms of this regulatory reform bill, I wanted to talk first about the amendments to the concession process for the DOC estate, Department of Conservation Estate. That is the one part of this bill that we'll be voting against. We'll be voting in favour of all the other amendment bills, but that's the one that we're voting against. And essentially, what the bill does is, when you're applying for a concession, a concession is the right to access or use parts of the Department of Conservation Estate, the conservation estate, for commercial purposes. Now, it's very important that there is a concession process so that parts of the DOC estate can be used for commercial purposes. But the Green Party believes that it's fundamental that the ecological or biodiversity bottom lines come first. So that has to be the fundamental starting point, is that we protect the ecological or environmental values of the DOC estate first. And concessions, or the ability to use the DOC estate for commercial purposes, are secondary to that. That is fundamental to our approach to concessions in the DOC estate. And essentially what this bill does is makes it harder for the Department of Conservation to protect those fundamental environmental or ecological values when they're considering commercial or applications to use the DOC estate for commercial purposes. And for that reason we're voting against that part, that amendment bill. Because when you think about it, and this is, I think, where it applies to the kind of philosophical approach to regulation that Jonathan Young was outlining, was that if we don't have regulations that fundamentally protect the DOC estate, if we don't have those regulations in place, then we will undermine the macro picture about what is one of the great benefits that New Zealand, one of the great opportunities or benefits that New Zealand has economically, which is our natural environment. When you look at the tourism industry, totally built on clean, green New Zealand. When you look at our primary produce exports, entirely built on clean, green and safe. And those things are built on the environmental integrity or the perception of environmental integrity, particularly associated with the Department of Conservation Estate or the protecting that conservation estate. So if our regulatory framework doesn't fundamentally protect the conservation estate, then we will undermine our economy as well as undermining the biodiversity values that we think are important. I mean, when you think about, who have been the great builders of the New Zealand economy, actually it's been the Greenies who, generation after generation, have protected the New Zealand environment. If you were to name one person who's made a huge contribution to the New Zealand economy, you could pick Kevin Smith. one of the campaigners who protected the west coast of the South Island against the opposition of many people in New Zealand, or many of the governments of New Zealand who wanted to allow the destruction of the west coast environment. People like Kevin played a fundamental role in actually building the foundations of our economy, because by protecting the natural environment, they basically protected the foundations of both the tourism industry and the primary production sector. So when we come to look at these kinds of regulatory reforms, if, as is the case in this bill, the regulatory reforms make it harder for DOC to protect the conservation estate, essentially not only do they make it harder to protect the biodiversity values that are important to New Zealanders and to the New Zealand identity, but they also make it harder to protect the foundation of the New Zealand economy. And so for that reason we don't support those changes, because they tilt the balance against protecting the natural environment. And so looking at the philosophical approach to regulatory reform, if you don't have strong regulations that protect the natural environment, then you don't protect the foundations of our economy. And I think that it is the kind of short-term thinking that is epitomised by the National Party, I think, in relation to this, where they think, oh, well, a bit of environmental degradation for a bit of economic growth, that's fine, and so we should have regulations that facilitate that. The Green Party takes a much more long-term approach, which says we need regulations that protect the natural environment for the long term, and not only does that protect the biodiversity and ecological values that are important to us, but in the long term it also protects our economy, because our economy is built on our environment, and so we need a strong regulatory framework to protect that environment. The second part of this bill that I want to talk about are the amendments around the Friendly Societies and Credit Unions Act. These are very good and important changes, and the Green Party is very pleased that these changes are here. There are there's a multitude of changes, but basically what they do is facilitate the ability of the credit unions to compete more effectively. Now, credit unions, I believe, are an important part of the financial system in New Zealand, and they provide a small but significant competition to some of the larger institutions. New Zealand, because of the way that privatisation was run in the 80s and 90s, we ended up with a banking sector that is extremely problematic and is dominated by the Australian-owned banks. And so having the Australian-owned banks dominating the finance sector has been a real problem for New Zealand. It's been a problem in terms of competition, and it's only with the emergence of Kiwibank really that we've had serious competition in the banking sector, because otherwise the Australian-owned banks were acting in a monopolistic manner and reducing competition. But it's also been a problem in terms of tax. The Australian-owned banks have been illegally and unlawfully avoiding tax. They unlawfully avoided $2 billion worth of tax, which the government had to spend $50 million in court cases to get back off them. So having the credit unions freed up so that they can compete better with the banks is important. It is, of course, important that we have proper prudential regulations in place to make sure that the credit unions do operate in a way which is safe for their investors, but it's also important that they be freed up so that they can at least be on a level playing field with the big banks so that they can compete with them, so that we do get some degree of competition in the banking and financial services sector, particularly for lower income New Zealanders, so that they don't get ripped off by the big Australian banks, which of course has been the history since the extremely poor privatisations that happened in New Zealand. So those two parts of the bill, there's the bit around changing the rules around concessions in the commercial use of the Department of Conservation Estate, which we don't support because they tilt the balance against the environment. And there's the parts around the credit union, which give credit union more of a chance to compete, I think are very, very good changes. So we'll be supporting all the other parts, but we'll be supporting all the parts except those changes around conservation. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
A point of order, Honourable Tau Henare.
Mr Speaker, I just wanted to seek some assistance from you about the tabling of media articles. Speaker's ruling 148(4)(3) last sentence, and if I can have just a bit of time to read it. It is not the intention at all to prevent the tabling of those or likewise media articles from overseas publications that would not be readily available to members but would be relevant to them. I seek leave of the House to table a Wall Street Journal article dated 27 July this year on charter schools.
Yes, well, as the member is aware, it is our normal practice not to table media that is currently available. And so then, given that it's an international one, the House can determine. So I'll put the leave assault for that purpose. A point of order.
Sure, it's not an online article.
It's not online? Not an online article. Order, we're not going to have a conversation. I think the point has been made. Yeah. I shall put the leave assault to table an international document from a overseas news source. Is there anyone opposed to that course of action? There is not. Leave is granted. Sam Lottawinga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.